Welcome back. In this video, we'll be defining the persuasive essay, otherwise known as the argumentative essay. So previously, we covered the various purposes behind why one might write. We discussed that one of the reasons that one might write is to inform. Another reason is to entertain. And yet another reason is to persuade and or argue for a certain stance or a course of action. So we'll be focusing on what it means to persuade and argue when writing an essay. And this is essentially the purpose behind the argumentative essay. We covered previously the expository essay, and the difference between the two is very simple. The expository essay is designed to explain and define. Whereas the argumentative essay or persuasive essay is designed to obviously argue or persuade. So there is no persuasive element to the expository essay. The expository essay will explain a topic and provide examples. But the goal is not to convince the reader of anything in particular. It's simply to give information. Whereas in the case of the argumentative essay, the goal is obviously argumentative. The point is to convince the reader to adopt a new way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. And rather than examples, the argumentative essay provides pieces of evidence to support the point of the writer. A good way to think about an argumentative essay is to think about it from the perspective of a lawyer. So typically when a lawyer, let's take a prosecutor, for example, enters the courtroom, he or she must convince the jury that the defendant is guilty of a crime. Let's say in this case, the defendant is accused of murder. So the prosecutor must convince the audience that the defendant is guilty of murder. So the claim in this case, this would be the point of the essay, is defendant is guilty. And to support, we obviously have different pieces of evidence. So evidence 1, evidence 2, etc. We can say that evidence 1 maybe is a fingerprint. Evidence 2 is lack of alibi, etc., etc. The point is that without the evidence, there obviously can be no persuasion of the ultimate claim or main point of the argument, which is that the defendant is guilty. So evidence is always going to be essential to any argumentative essay. What does an argumentative essay look like in the wild or in the classroom? So typically students will be given for or against topics. This is the most typical way of encountering an argumentative essay. So some prompts that a student might see are very simple. They're usually arguing for whether or not the reader should do one thing or another. So one could be, should students wear uniforms? You'll see something like this pretty often. So obviously on one hand, you have students should wear uniforms because, on the other hand, you have the perspective that students should not wear uniforms because, etc. Another possible example could be something like, should books be banned if they're controversial? So should controversial books be banned? Obviously, the essay can be one of two perspectives. That being to either ban the books or not ban the books, and there would be evidence provided from both sides. It's also possible to see a different type of essay prompt, which is a little more subtle and sophisticated. It doesn't necessarily ask for a for or against stance on a topic, but it will ask instead for the writer to consider the extent of something's importance. So to what extent is the topic important? This is another common type of argumentative essay. One will also encounter argumentative essays when reading things like editorials and op-eds. So usually these are arguing for a certain type of policy, or they're arguing for a certain type of behavior on the part of the public or from politicians. And these are naturally argumentative. They forward some kind of point that they want to convince the reader of, and then they provide evidence for and against the main argument, as well as against counter arguments. So to review quickly, an argumentative essay essentially is forwarding some kind of idea or behavior that the writer wants the reader to adopt. And in support of that argumentative essay, there is, or argumentative point rather, there is piece of evidence. So there's always some kind of argument. And then of course there is supporting evidence in defense of the argument. Now, beyond evidence, there are other components that can affect the success of an argumentative essay, and we'll look at those in a future video. Those are called the argumentative components. So with that said, I hope that this gave you some extra clarity as far as the purpose of a persuasive and argumentative essay. And I hope you'll join me in the following video when we look at the argumentative essay and its components in more detail. Thanks for your time.